A bone-chilling wind howled through the cracked walls of the cabin, rattling the shutters like an unseen predator. Inside, the fire was barely a whisper of warmth, and the only sound was the steady creak of a wooden chair as Thomas King worked a blade in his hands, carving into the rough wood. The outside world felt like a distant memory, until, without warning, there came a knock. Soft at first, then louder, faster, 3 knocks, quick and sharp. A sound that broke through the silence like a challenge. Thomas's hand froze. It had been years since anyone had knocked on his door, and the last time, it hadn't ended well. He stood slowly, boots scraping against the floor as the cabin groaned in protest, as though the walls themselves feared what was coming. He reached for the door handle, his fingers cold against the rusted metal. As he swung it open, the freezing wind poured inside, stinging his face and carrying with it the scent of snow and desperation. There, standing in the doorway, were 3 figures, 2 girls, barely more than children, their faces pale with cold and fear. Between them was a third, smaller bundle, wrapped in a worn shawl. The eldest girl, her eyes wide with caution, took a step forward. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of something far heavier. "Can you buy our kitten, mister?" she asked, her breath fogging in the cold. "Our mama's real sick." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his heart pounding. Those eyes, he knew them. His throat tightened, and a knot of unease twisted deep in his gut. This was no coincidence. He had seen those eyes before, years ago, in another lifetime. Before we begin, we'd love for you to watch the story closely, and by the end, rate out of 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us understand the kind of stories you enjoy, and it guides us in creating even better content for you. The wind bit at Thomas's skin as the girls stood motionless in the doorway. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but the sight of the kitten in the girl's hands made his heart twist. Its fur was pure white, trembling in the cold, its eyes wide with fear. He swallowed hard, stepping aside without a word, letting them in. They didn't speak, but the eldest girl gave a quick, grateful nod. Thomas shut the door behind them, the wind howling outside like a warning. Boone, his old hound, raised his head and sniffed at the newcomers, but stayed in his spot by the hearth, as though sensing the unease in the room. The girls sat quietly, shoulders hunched, as if they feared to break the stillness. Thomas, hands trembling, ladled broth into bowls. The warmth of the room felt like a lie, but he couldn't stop it. He watched them eat in silence. The eldest girl, who hadn't yet spoken her name, looked at Thomas as she spooned the broth into her mouth. Her gaze was sharp, cautious, and her eyes, those eyes, stirred something buried deep in his chest. He hadn't expected it, but there it was. The same shade of blue he once knew, now older, wiser worn. He cleared his throat. "Where's your mother?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "She's sick," the girl whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "We've been walking for days. She can't walk no more." Thomas stiffened. The cold that had crept inside his heart seemed to settle deeper. He'd heard of a family out west, disappearing. Had it been them? The smallest girl, no older than 8, clutched the kitten close, its warmth offering comfort in the harsh reality of their world. "She said if we find someone with a warm roof, we could trade the kitten for help," the eldest added. Thomas's throat tightened as he looked at the kitten, its little body curled into the girl's arms. It wasn't just a cat. It was a piece of something he once had, a life long forgotten. The memories came flooding back. The warmth of his wife's laugh, the way their children used to run through the fields. The house had been filled with love once, not like this cold, empty cabin. He stood up abruptly, moving to the window. The snowstorm had worsened outside, the landscape disappearing beneath a blanket of white. For a moment, he felt trapped, not just by the storm, but by the memories. He turned back to the girls. "Where are you from?" They didn't answer right away. The silence stretched. Finally, the eldest spoke, her voice soft, almost distant. "Far from here. Past Thorn Hill, through the rivers." Mama told us to come find help before. Thomas's hand gripped the window frame as his mind raced. He knew those paths, the ones she spoke of, well enough. The journey wasn't an easy one. The girls had come too far to be lying. They had to be telling the truth. The fire crackled behind him, but the warmth didn't reach the pit in his stomach. "You came alone?" he asked, his voice rough. The eldest girl nodded. Her face was weary, pale from the cold. "We didn't have a choice. Mama, she told us to go. She told us to find help and not stop until we did." A cold wind swept through the room as the door creaked open slightly. The girls flinched, and the kitten stirred in the smallest girl's arms. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. He had never been one for heroism, but something in this moment in their faces felt like fate. Thomas knew what he had to do. He couldn't turn them away. The storm outside raged on, but his mind was clear now. His heart, heavy with regret, had room for these lost souls. They didn't need a transaction. They needed a chance. "Stay the night," he said, his voice firm. "The storm's not letting up. We'll figure it out in the morning." The eldest girl nodded, her eyes meeting his, with a mix of relief and suspicion. The smallest girl curled up next to Boone. The kitten nestled between them, both seeking comfort in the warmth of the fire. Thomas sat back down, watching them. He felt a strange sense of connection, as if this moment had been waiting for him, just as the storm had waited to bring them here. The fire crackled softly in the background, but Thomas couldn't focus on it. His thoughts were tangled in the past, memories he'd long buried. As he watched the girls settle by the fire, his eyes flicked to the eldest girl. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but there was something in the way she carried herself, guarded yet determined. "Where's your father?" Thomas asked, trying to break the silence. The girl's eyes flickered for a moment, and then she looked down at the kitten in her lap. "He left when we were young," she said quietly, her voice flat. Thomas nodded. He knew better than to press further. They all had ghosts, but these girls carried theirs silently. The smallest girl, Ellie, yawned and curled up closer to Boone. The warmth of the fire seemed to settle them. Thomas's gaze softened, but the weight of the night still hung heavy in the cabin. The next morning came slowly, with the snow still falling relentlessly outside. Thomas woke early, the cabin eerily quiet except for the soft sounds of the girls stirring. The eldest girl, June, was already sitting by the fire, eyes distant. "You should rest," Thomas said as he poured himself a cup of coffee. June shook her head. "I'm all right. Just thinking." Her words hung in the air, and Thomas knew she was thinking of her mother. He had seen it before, people holding on to what little hope they had left, even when all the signs pointed to the end. Thomas's hand tightened around his cup, his own grief resurfacing, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he turned to prepare the morning meal. Silence filled the room, only broken by the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the girls shifting. The storm didn't let up by midday. Thomas knew it would be foolish to send them out into the wilderness again, not in this kind of weather. They needed to wait it out, but the feeling of uncertainty gnawed at him. He had to know more. "Tell me about your mother," he asked June, his voice gentle. She hesitated, glancing at her sisters before speaking. "Her name's Mary. She was strong always, but lately it's been harder for her." Her voice trembled, but she quickly regained her composure. "She tried to stay strong for us." But Thomas's heart twisted, but he didn't show it. He had seen too many people come through hardship, trying to put up walls to protect themselves. But walls had a way of falling. As June spoke, Thomas felt the weight of the storm outside and inside his own heart. He didn't know how much longer he could hold onto his own silence. By the evening, the storm had only grown worse. The cabin creaked under the pressure, and the fire was nearly out, despite Thomas's best efforts to keep it going. The girls sat huddled by the hearth, their faces pale from the cold. Thomas glanced out the window, the wind howling like a wolf. There was no way the roads would be passable for days. He couldn't keep them here forever. "What happens when the storm clears?" he asked, his voice low. June looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "We'll go back to Mama. She needs us." Thomas nodded, though the unease gnawed at him. He had lived through his own share of storms, both in the world and within himself. But something about this situation felt different. The room felt heavy, as if the walls were closing in. As the girls fell into a fitful sleep, Thomas stayed awake, listening to the storm outside. The next morning, the storm was still raging, but there was a faint light breaking through the clouds, signaling that the worst was over. Thomas stood by the window, watching the snow swirl, his thoughts clouded. The girls had started packing their things, getting ready to leave. June caught his eye and gave him a quiet nod. "We'll be fine. Thank you for everything." But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't ready to go. There was something in their eyes, something they weren't telling him. "Wait a little longer," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "The roads are still dangerous. You can't go out there in this condition." June's lips pressed into a tight line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded again, sitting back down by the fire with her sisters. The silence stretched, and Thomas couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. He hadn't been prepared for this, but now it was too late to turn back. The fire crackled softly as the morning light filtered through the snow outside. Thomas stood by the stove, stirring the pot, his thoughts drifting. The storm had passed, but the weight of the decision to send the girls out was still heavy. He had kept them here for 2 days now, trying to offer comfort in the midst of uncertainty. June stood by the door, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something, someone. "I have to go. Mama's waiting." Thomas's chest tightened at the thought of sending them out into the wilderness. "It's not safe yet," he said quietly. She turned toward him, her eyes fierce with determination. "We don't have a choice." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but the words stuck. He couldn't stop her, not when her heart was set on it. He nodded slowly, standing silently as they gathered their things. The moment of truth was at hand. As the girls prepared to leave, the weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Thomas had offered them all the supplies he could: rags, a few scraps of food, and his last set of gloves. June took the gloves without a word, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled them on. Ellie, the youngest, clutched the kitten close, its small body nestled in her arms. Her face was pale, but there was a look of quiet resolve in her eyes. Thomas's heart sank as he watched them, knowing the journey ahead would be treacherous. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We have to," June replied, her voice steady but tinged with fear. Thomas watched them leave, his stomach twisted in knots. The door clicked shut behind them, and for the first time, the cabin felt emptier than ever before. Thomas stood at the door for a long moment, watching the girls disappear into the snow. The storm had cleared, but the wind still whipped through the barren landscape, as unforgiving as ever. He stepped back inside, but the warmth of the fire didn't reach him. He paced the room, unable to shake the feeling of helplessness gnawing at him. They were too young to be out there, but June had been determined. He couldn't keep them trapped here forever. Boone, his old hound, wandered over and sat at his feet, sensing the tension in the air. Thomas absently scratched behind his ears. He should have tried harder to stop them. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Then a knock came. It was soft at first, barely audible above the wind, but it was there. Thomas froze, his heart racing. The knock came again, louder this time. He glanced quickly at the window, but saw nothing but the swirling snow. Who could be out there? He walked slowly toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The cold air hit him like a slap when he opened it. Standing in the doorway, looking as if the storm had never touched them, were the girls. Their faces were drawn, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Ellie was holding the kitten tightly, her small body trembling. Thomas stepped back, confusion and relief flooding him all at once. "You're back," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "We couldn't make it," June said softly, her voice broken. "Mama, she's gone." The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, Thomas didn't know what to say. The girls entered quietly, their heads bowed in sorrow. June collapsed onto the bench by the hearth, burying her face in her hands. Ellie curled up beside her, clutching the kitten like a lifeline. The room was heavy with grief. Thomas stood silently, watching them. He didn't know what to say, or if words even mattered at this point. He had seen enough loss in his life to understand the silence that followed it. June finally looked up, her eyes red and raw. "We couldn't save her," she whispered. "We tried. We did everything we could." Thomas stepped forward, unsure of what comfort to offer. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did all you could. Sometimes it's just not enough." The words felt hollow, but they were all he had. He glanced at the snow outside, wondering if things would ever feel right again. The evening passed in a somber quiet, the weight of the girls' loss pressing down on the small cabin. June and Ellie slept fitfully near the fire, their bodies curled together for warmth. Thomas sat in the chair by the window, watching the snow fall outside. Boone lay at his feet, sensing the tension in the air, but even the hound seemed subdued. Thomas's thoughts were scattered, trying to piece together a future he wasn't prepared for. The girls had nowhere to go, and he couldn't send them back out into the cold again. He had always been alone, but now he wasn't. The flickering light of the fire cast long shadows across the room, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt the stirrings of something other than grief, something he hadn't expected. By morning, the snow had slowed to a gentle fall, but the air was still bitterly cold. Thomas had already started to prepare a small breakfast when he heard June stir. She stood slowly, looking as if every movement took more effort than it should. Her eyes were distant, hollow with sorrow, but there was a faint spark of determination behind them. "We can't stay here forever," June said quietly. "I need to bury her. We need to say goodbye." Thomas nodded slowly. He knew the importance of closure, of honoring the dead, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of what she was asking. "I'll help you," he said, his voice soft. "I'll help you bury her." They ate in silence, the gravity of the moment hanging over them. The journey ahead, the road to healing, was still uncertain, but Thomas had made his decision. They weren't alone anymore. The sun hung low in the sky as Thomas and the girls made their way outside. The snow had left a blanket of silence across the land, muffling their footsteps as they walked toward the small plot near the cabin. June walked ahead, her shoulders heavy with grief. Ellie close behind her, still clutching the kitten. Thomas followed, his heart heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. He had known loss, but to see it reflected in the eyes of these young girls felt like something else entirely. They reached the spot where June had decided to lay her mother to rest. The ground was frozen, but the work had to be done. Thomas knelt beside them, helping where he could, the silence between them almost too much to bear. This was a goodbye neither of them were ready for. By the time the small grave was dug, the sun had begun to set, casting an orange glow across the land. June stood still, staring at the freshly turned earth, her face unreadable. Ellie sat beside her, the kitten curled in her lap, its eyes wide with quiet curiosity. Thomas stood a few feet away, respecting their space, yet unable to pull himself away from the scene. The grief in the air was palpable, but so was the quiet strength of these two girls. June finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay here. I don't know where we'll go, but we can't stay here anymore." Thomas didn't answer right away. He understood the need for change, for escape from the memories. "You'll have a place here," he said finally, "if you need it." The next few days passed in a blur. The girls stayed close, their sorrow still fresh but slowly beginning to give way to the quiet rhythm of survival. Thomas kept them fed and warm, but there was a tension in the air. They were still strangers in his world, even if they no longer felt like it. June had begun to take small steps toward healing. She helped Thomas with the chores around the cabin, her hands shaking but steady. Ellie, ever the quiet one, spent her time with the kitten, talking to it as if it were the only family left. Thomas watched them from a distance, the guilt of not being able to do more weighing heavily on him. He had taken them in, but the road ahead was still uncertain. All he knew for sure was that they were no longer alone in the cold world outside. Thomas woke early the next morning, the air inside the cabin biting with cold. The girls were still asleep, huddled together near the fire, their breaths visible in the dim light. He quietly moved about the room, tending to the hearth and making breakfast. June had started to take on more responsibility, cooking and tending to small tasks around the cabin. But there was still a quiet sadness in her eyes that never seemed to fade. Ellie, on the other hand, clung to the kitten as if it were the only thing holding her together. Thomas couldn't help but wonder what the future held for them. They needed more than just survival. They needed peace. The day stretched out before him, filled with small moments of normalcy. Yet beneath it all, a constant undercurrent of uncertainty pulsed. Where would they go next? What would the future bring? As the days passed, the tension in the cabin began to shift. June started to speak more, though her words were few and measured. She had taken up the task of mending their clothes, and while she worked, her thoughts seemed to drift to places far away. Thomas observed her closely. There was a quiet resilience about her, but also a rawness in her eyes that reminded him of his own grief. He had lost so much in his life, but these girls, they were just beginning to carry their burden. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked one evening as he watched June repair a tear in her dress. She didn't look up at first, but after a moment, she nodded. "I'm fine. Just keeping busy." Thomas didn't press her any further. Some wounds weren't ready to be touched. He could only offer a quiet, understanding silence. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath the cold. Ellie wandered outside, the kitten in her arms, her eyes bright with curiosity. June followed behind, hesitant but determined, as if she were trying to reclaim a piece of herself in the fresh air. Thomas watched them from the window, his thoughts still heavy with the questions that gnawed at him. They couldn't stay here forever. He had nothing to offer them but the warmth of this cabin. He stood up slowly, walking toward the door. The day was calm, but the restlessness inside him wouldn't be quieted. He had to talk to them. They needed to know there was a way forward, somewhere, somehow. That afternoon, Thomas sat down with the girls by the fire. The warmth of the room contrasted with the coolness of the world outside. He felt the weight of the conversation press upon him, but he couldn't avoid it any longer. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "The storm's passed, but there's nothing left for you here." June looked at him, her face unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I mean," Thomas continued, "you need a place where you can rebuild, a place that doesn't carry all this sadness." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. June glanced at Ellie, who was still clutching the kitten. "You're right," she said finally, her voice small but determined. "But where will we go?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Where would they go? The world outside the cabin was vast, cold, and unforgiving. But Thomas couldn't keep them here, not when their futures stretched out before them. June stood up, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know where we'll go, but I'll figure it out. I have to." Thomas nodded slowly, watching the fire flicker. He knew she was right. She had to find her own way, just as he had done years ago. The decision felt final, but it didn't bring relief. It only deepened the uncertainty. He had taken them in, offered them shelter, but now they had to walk their own path. He rose and stepped toward the window. The world outside was still cold, but the light was beginning to change. Maybe there was a way forward after all. The following days were filled with preparations. The girls began to pack what little they had, sorting through their belongings. Ellie still clung to the kitten, and June worked in silence, her determination clear. Thomas had begun to gather supplies, food, extra blankets, anything they could use on the road. He didn't know where they would go, but he knew they couldn't stay here forever. The day before they were to leave, June approached him. "Do you know any place we can go?" she asked quietly, her voice still tinged with uncertainty. Thomas hesitated. He knew a few small towns to the south, places where people lived a little less harshly. "I'll take you to the nearest town. We'll figure it out from there." June nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. The morning of their departure arrived quietly. The sun was hidden behind a layer of clouds, and the air was crisp, almost cold enough to bite. The girls had packed everything they could carry, and Thomas made one last check of the cabin. He didn't want to leave. The cabin had become a home of sorts, a place of refuge, however temporary. But it wasn't enough. They needed more than shelter. They needed a future. June and Ellie said little as they bundled up against the cold, but Thomas saw the weight in their eyes. They were leaving behind more than just a cabin. They were leaving behind a part of themselves. "Ready?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. June looked at him, her face set with quiet resolve. "As ready as we'll ever be." The journey out was slow, the snow still thick on the ground, but the sky was clear. They trudged through the frozen landscape, the cabin disappearing behind them. The cold air bit at their faces, but they kept moving forward. Thomas led the way, but his mind was filled with doubts. What had he truly given them? A safe place for a few days, a warm meal, but the world was still harsh and unforgiving. June walked beside him, her face drawn with worry, but she didn't speak. Ellie followed closely behind, still holding the kitten close. She looked up at Thomas every now and then, as if seeking some unspoken reassurance. As they moved further from the cabin, Thomas could feel the weight of what they were about to face. They traveled for hours, the silence between them growing heavier with each step. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was a quiet determination in June's eyes. She wasn't the same girl who had knocked on his door just days ago. They stopped to rest briefly by a small creek. Thomas pulled out the last of their food and shared it among them. Ellie took a small piece of bread. The kitten still nestled in her arms, its fur soft and warm. Thomas watched them, his thoughts swirling. The road was long, and he had no clear answers for them. But one thing was certain. He couldn't turn back now. They had to keep moving, one step at a time. By evening, they reached a small town nestled in the valley. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shadows. Thomas could see the smoke rising from chimneys, the faint glow of lanterns flickering in the windows. He turned to the girls. "We'll stay here for the night. We'll figure out the next step in the morning." June nodded, though the anxiety in her eyes remained. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring. They walked into the town, their footsteps muffled by the snow-covered streets. The world felt small here, quieter, but still full of uncertainty. As they entered a small inn, Thomas felt a strange sense of relief. They had made it this far, and for now, that would have to be enough. The inn was warm, but it didn't feel like home. The girls slept fitfully, curled up together under the thin blankets. Thomas stayed awake for hours, listening to the muffled sounds of the town outside. The next morning, they were greeted by a cold, overcast sky. The town was small, with little more than a few shops, a tavern, and an old church. Thomas didn't know what he had expected, but this wasn't it. June woke first, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She looked at Thomas, her face marked with the strain of the past days. What now? She asked softly. Thomas hesitated. We'll talk to the townspeople. See if we can find work, or a place to stay. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. They had come this far. The rest would have to fall into place somehow. They left the inn early, the cold morning air biting at their faces as they walked through the town. The streets were quiet, with only a few people milling about, bundled up against the chill. Thomas led the way to the general store. He hoped they could find some work, or at least a place where the girls could stay while he tried to figure things out. The storekeeper, an older man with gray hair and a stern face, looked at them warily. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice flat. "We're just passing through," Thomas said, his voice steady but unsure. "Looking for work." The storekeeper studied them for a moment before nodding slowly. "We could use help around here, if you're willing, but you'll have to prove yourselves." It was a start, and for now that was enough. The storekeeper, Mr. Dawes, set them to work unloading crates of goods. Thomas worked alongside the girls, his muscles aching from the long hours, but it felt good to be doing something. The routine was simple: work hard, keep your head down, and hope for the best. June worked diligently, her hands steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. Ellie, though quieter than ever, managed to help where she could, carrying small bundles of supplies and speaking little. As the day wore on, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were just surviving, not truly living. But this was what they had to do. They were all learning how to live in the world again. As the sun began to set, Mr. Dawes approached Thomas. "You've done well today," he said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "You're welcome to stay for the night. We'll see how you do tomorrow." That evening, Thomas and the girls were given a small room at the back of the store. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry. The girls quickly made themselves comfortable, unpacking the few things they had. Thomas sat at the edge of the bed, his mind still racing. They were in a strange town, with no clear path forward. But they had food, shelter, and work. For now, that was enough. June sat next to him, her face tired but softening. "Do you think this is it?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Thomas replied, looking out the small window at the town. "But we'll make it work. We have to." June nodded, though the doubt in her eyes didn't fade. "I hope so." Thomas didn't know what the future held, but he couldn't afford to stop trying. The following days were filled with hard work and little conversation. Thomas, June, and Ellie continued to help around the store, and though they were still strangers to the town, they began to blend in. June had started talking to some of the other workers, quietly learning more about the town's way of life. Ellie, on the other hand, spent most of her time with the kitten, finding comfort in its presence. Thomas watched them both, his heart heavy. They were adapting, but he knew they were still carrying the weight of their past. He couldn't help them heal. It was something they would have to do on their own. One evening, Mr. Dawes offered them a new deal. "We could use someone to help out more around town. There's a farm just outside. You'd make good money." Thomas didn't hesitate. The offer was a lifeline, and he knew they couldn't stay in the store forever. "We'll take it," he said without a second thought. June looked at him, her brow furrowed. "Are you sure? We don't know anything about farming." "It's work," Thomas replied, a hint of hope in his voice. "And we can start over. We need to." The next morning, they packed their things once again, leaving the warmth of the store behind. They made their way to the farm, a small place with fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The land was quiet, peaceful even, but it felt alien to Thomas. But he wasn't here to look for peace. He was here to survive, and to give the girls a chance. The farm owner, a grizzled man named Mr. Harris, gave them a skeptical look when they arrived. "You're city folk, aren't you?" he asked, sizing them up. Thomas nodded. "We're willing to work. We just need a chance." Mr. Harris grunted and walked away. "We'll see what you can do. Get to work." The first few days were hard. The work was grueling, the land unforgiving. But June and Ellie adapted quickly, their hands roughening with every task. Thomas worked alongside them, his muscles aching and his back sore, but it felt like something they could manage. The routine was simple, but it was honest. By the end of the week, Mr. Harris spoke up again. "You're doing well. Keep it up, and you'll have a place here." For the first time since they'd arrived, Thomas allowed himself a breath of relief. The weeks passed slowly, but the work on the farm gave them a sense of purpose. Thomas, June, and Ellie began to feel a rhythm, waking early, working hard, and resting in the quiet evenings. But as the days went on, Thomas noticed something in June's eyes, a spark of something more than survival. She was becoming stronger, more confident. She started to take charge of certain tasks, showing a quiet strength he hadn't seen before. Ellie, too, seemed to grow more comfortable. She spent less time clinging to the kitten, her laughter slowly returning. It was small, but it was something. Thomas allowed himself a moment of peace, watching them. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting to live. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Mr. Harris looked at them and said, "You're good workers. The land's hard, but you've made it yours." Thomas nodded, grateful for the recognition. "We've learned a lot." June smiled faintly. "We've found a way." Mr. Harris glanced between them, then leaned forward. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like. But don't forget, the world out there doesn't always offer second chances. You've got something good here." Thomas nodded, his heart swelling with pride for the girls. They had come so far. For the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself to feel hope. Maybe they could finally put the past behind them and start building a future. The seasons changed, and with it, life on the farm. The days were filled with work, but there was laughter too. June, Ellie, and Thomas had made a home out of what had once been nothing more than a struggle for survival. Thomas looked at the girls one evening as they worked side by side in the fields, the sun setting behind them. They were no longer the scared, lost girls who had knocked on his door months ago. He smiled to himself. They had found their place. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt like he had, too. The road had been long, but they had made it. Together. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.